Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so thrilled to be here today as part of the North Bend Film Festival. New to the festival this year, and why we are here today, is the introduction of the Dulac Vanguard Filmmaker Award. Named after French filmmaker, film theorist, and activist Germaine Dulac, her 1928 film The Seashell and the Clergyman is regarded as the defining first film of the Surrealist movement. The award honors an extraordinary achievement in groundbreaking filmmaking with a director's first or sophomore feature. This year's recipient is Jane Schoenbrunn for their debut narrative feature, We're All Going to the World's Fair. World's Fair is a beautifully haunting work that captures with surreal relevance the dual sadness and hope of life lived through a screen. We'd love to give a special shout out to local artist and storyteller Bob Antone, who carved this lovely trophy that Jane has right there. Thank you so much to Bob for creating that for us. Bob is a local artist and storyteller and has a story about the award that he would love for us to share. Once there was a special boy who became the moon. His mother lived in the village of Tolt. His father, a red star man, lived in the sky world above this one. Half star and half human, Moon had the power to shape the world into whatever he imagined. He created the salmon and deer as we know it. Everything was put into order. Moon taught the first people how to live in the world he had created for them. After a time, visitors came. They rolled in on wagons carrying tools and guns made of iron and steel. More of them arrived, establishing farms and homes along the river. Barons cut down whole forests, leveled mountainsides, laid tracks for the railroad, drained rivers or built up dams. Just like the Transformer, they changed the land forever. In 1989, the spotted owl controversy came to a head. Thousands of log truck drivers drove cross country to protest the closing of mills and loss of timber jobs due to environmental regulations. As the owl became more protected, logging families moved east. After the plywood mill fire of 1989 and as Microsoft grew to prominence in the early 1990s, the landscape changed yet again. Cabins, homesteads, and stump ranches became townhomes, commercial spaces, strip malls, and parking lots. An entirely different world was born. And this is the story of three Transformers. Special thanks again to Bob for the award and for sharing that lovely story with us. And I am so thrilled today to welcome the fantastic filmmaker Jane Schoenbrunn. And I wanted to dive straight into talking about We're Going to the World's Fair, because I know that as a teenager you spent a lot of time on the internet, and in particular I loved hearing that you spent a lot of time on a Wes Craven and Scream message board. And what I was interested about in terms of that as an influence is just your film so beautifully captures the imagination and the creativity that really exists amongst strangers and the vulnerability and spaces that people share. And so I was really interested in how you wanted to tap into that idea of inner creativity and imagination that's shared amongst strangers and transfer that into the film in the way that you told it.
Well, it's lovely to be here. I'm very honored to be the recipient of this award. I don't know that I've ever gotten an award, or at least not since like middle school. So this is a good first award. It's a big first award. I'm going to keep this guy on camera with me. And and yeah, to get an award that's named after a famous surrealist filmmaker is my kind of award. I'd rather have that than an Oscar. So very happy and honored to be here. Bummed I can't be in person with everybody at North Bend, but maybe next year. I okay, so yeah, I made a movie, and like you said, Mara, it's sort of it's not an autobiographical film, but I am certainly reflecting on my childhood, which was largely mediated through a screen, and I think that's a very common thing for people in my generation and all of the generations below, but we're just starting to sort of develop a language, cinematically and otherwise, to really like talk about that. My theory has always been that it's kind of like the most prevalent invisible thing that we don't really see in our art, especially film, because people classically think of filming a screen as kind of boring, or uncinematic. And one of my main goals with World's Fair was to sort of like take a stab at developing that language and developing something that could really speak authentically about what it feels like to be 13 in the basement of your parents' house, plugged into this strange nether world on the computer. um, for me, the internet, I think, was like a place to experiment as an artist at a really young age, in a way that was like disconnected from reality. And I think like a lot of what I'm reflecting on in the film is how it's also like disconnected from identity and from like physical identity. I, I'm a queer and transgendered filmmaker, and what I'm trying to reflect on in the film and in this is like sort of an experience of dysphoria that I certainly carried with me as a teenager, but didn't quite have a name for. This sort of feeling that there was something about my life that wasn't quite right or wasn't quite real. And, as this sort of like frustrated young queer person and frustrated young artist, I definitely like sort of went looking for answers to those things at a very young age, and long before I would figure out the answers to those things through just strange screen travels and kind of like amateur outsider art that I would make as a kid and teenager.
Yeah. I also wanted to talk about your script writing process, because I know that even when you were writing the script that you were listening to music by Alex G, who ended up composing music for the film. And it sounds like a lot of your process involves creating almost an immersive sensory experience for yourself. And so I was very curious into what that looks like, and the type of mindset that you really want to be able to put yourself into, especially for a film like this, where you're playing with the idea of consciousness and unconsciousness within the same realm.
I love that question. Really thoughtful question. Thank you. And yeah, I really wanted to challenge myself with this, my first feature, and hopefully with everything I do. Like I think I'm in a lot of ways like a structure. I guess I'd say like a post-structuralist, but like structure is very important to me. Like the canvas that I'm painting on and the structure of the entire screenplay that I'm conceiving of is something that I think I obsess about, perhaps more than most. And I'm well versed in the rules of screenwriting, right? And the rules of like act structure and character arc and hero's journey. But I find that kind of boring. It just doesn't, and I do think it has something to do with growing up trans and growing up like a weirdo that like I want like a harder hit of something, or I want something that feels more authentic to like the weirdness of the way I experience the world. And, and so a huge part of developing this project was about crafting a structure for the film that felt true to myself and true to like the themes and emotions and questions that I wanted to explore in the movie. And it's a long process. And in some ways it's an intuitive process. And in some ways it's like a very, I would always describe the process, I mean, honestly, of making a film, and of which obviously writing the script is just like maybe the first third of it. I would always describe it as like building a bridge, just like conceiving of like there's a body of water and you need to build a bridge over it. Like such a gigantic thing to try to do. You need to have like an overall blueprint of like how it's all going to hold together. But then you also need to be able on certain days to like zoom in just on that one tiny part of that arch and just focus on how to make the base of it as perfect as possible, or the top of it, whatever it might be. And for me, like the process, the development and creative process, which on this film was years long, was for something that's very simple or appears very simple perhaps on screen, was this gigantic process of like zooming in and out, and and having like a picture of the overall thing that I was trying to build and craft, but then being able to like get just as deep into each specific moment in the film for its own pleasure and meaning. And then towards like the mood and tone are so important to me. I'm a big believer that like story is one thing, but it's how you tell a story and how you express yourself. And the films that I love most and the films that linger longest with me are the ones where like 2 months later or a year later, that film is still living in my memory. That film, is sort of like mutated over time and like taken up space. It almost like become a new world that I want to return to, or that I half remember like from a dream. And so I think the way you achieve that phenomenon, as a filmmaker, is just really, like texture, mood, atmosphere, tone, like all of the things that aren't just like pushing the movie along or the plot along like a roller coaster ride, but that are evoking feeling or moments. The aesthetics of it were so important to me. And I really took my time with them in the writing process. And yeah, it's almost like a form of meditation. I would the music I was writing to is always really important to me in like getting me in the right mood. Just like clearing my brain out was always really important. I tend to do my best work in the morning, so there was always this rhythm of like waking up and having a cup of coffee and getting right into this sort of peaceful state. And why I'm so excited to be accepting a award named after a surrealist is that I do sort of consider myself a surrealist, but I more I did a ton of reading around the time of writing World's Fair into like the like Freud and Jung, and I'm really fascinated by like the unconscious, and I'm fascinated by I think my artistic process, one of my goals is always to be getting beyond conscious daytime brain into unconscious nighttime dream brain logic, because that stuff has a logic. It's not just random throw it at the wall, whatever goes goes, that you can just like dream up and spit out onto a page. Like I know that like there are surrealist practices that are literally what I just described, but it's not so much me. What I like is getting myself into such a sort of like trance-like meditative state with the work that I'm doing, that I'm able to almost like shut my conscious brain off at points to access these more sort of like unconscious associations that I think are like the poetry almost of the work.
I mean, with that obsession and fascination that you have with the unconscious, I actually wanted to talk about one of your previous projects when you produced Collective Unconscious, because that's a film that definitely still sears on my mind in terms of the concept and what you put together, which was having different filmmakers write down a dream that they'd had, share it with another filmmaker, and have them interpret that. And there was kind of a lot of playing around with the idea of consciousness within that film. And so I was very interested in, having worked on a project like that and worked with other independent filmmakers who were exploring that space, how that potentially influenced World's Fair for you in any ways.
Um, Yeah, I mean, that was my first Collective Unconscious. This was an omnibus film that we made in 2015 that I was more like the ringleader of than one of the, I was a major creative voice and I was sort of like the conductor of the orchestra, but it was directed by 5 other filmmakers. And I had this idea, for me, I'd been working like day jobs in the film industry, and I had sort of like found a real passion for a certain kind of work. And I think I was sort of like taking the first tiny little steps into my own artistic journey by conceiving of a project for that I would work with other people that I really respected on. And the prompt, like you said, was having each filmmaker adapt another one's dreams. And so I sort of orchestrated this process where they each wrote to me about a dream that they'd had, very brief, sort of like tweet length statements. And I assigned each person another person's dream and didn't tell them whose dream they had. And then we all sort of like collaboratively, but also individually, went off and made these 5 different short films that eventually got combined into an omnibus and premiered at South by Southwest. And it's actually available for free online. I'm still in love with that project. I think it's a wonderful one. I I learned so much from it, both about like making work and like just logistically how to pull together like a film that's made with a pretty intimate crew and scope, but can still sort of like reach really high artistically. Um, and I did learn a lot from the filmmakers about dream logic and how to capture it on film. I I think the most important lesson for me there that I really have sort of like almost developed into my own practice of like how I think about any work that I'm making that's sort of dipping its toe into something other than realism, which is everything. I don't think there's such a thing as like a realistic film. Everything is sort of a reflection in this medium. I but with Collective Unconscious, what I learned is that it's not just about, and I'm kind of repeating myself now, but it's not just about throwing strange things at the wall, or if somebody had a dream about like a gym class in a volcano, which is one of the 5 films in Collective Unconscious. You can't just open on like a gymnasium and volcano, stuff pouring into it. I mean, I suppose you can, but one thing I really learned from this process was like, if you want to really effectively break reality, you need to actually have like a firmer grip on how you're representing reality. I have this sort of like personal theory that I think of as like the gradient theory of reality, is what I call it with myself, where when you're making dreamlike work or surrealist work, and David Lynch, I think, is a master of this. I watch his films and I'm so inspired by them. Sort of like every every piece of the film is a different level removed from what like the viewer thinks of as reality, and nothing is pure reality, but it's sort of again this structuralist idea of like all of them speaking to each other. So for instance, in Lauren Wolkstein's film, One of the Five in Collective Unconscious, the gym class and the volcano film, we start in sort of a grounded way. And then right in the middle of the film, there's this 8-minute one shot that's just a slow zoom on this gym class. And it starts with like fairly realistic sound design. And by the end of this long one shot, the film has just totally transformed and almost like, again, trapped you in this trance-like state. And the sound design is incredibly expressive and strange, and that's when the volcano strikes. And so I don't know, I carry that with me, and with a film like World's Fair, a very important part of my process and a very important part of the structure of the film is sort of like grounding you in reality and then slowly questioning your perspective on what reality is. The structure for World's Fair in its simplest form is that we start with one person in a bedroom. We drift closer and closer towards the screen until we're lost in the internet. And then eventually we come out the other end of the screen in somebody else's bedroom. And the pleasure of the movie, so much for me, is this drift towards the screen until you can't even tell the difference between the screen that the character is watching and the movie that we're watching.
And one of the things about the film is it's so visually striking, and even the fact that before I saw the film, that still image that you have of Anna Cobb holding the thing in front of her eye and the glow in the dark paint was already something that had become synonymous with your film to me, because it's just such a striking image. And it always sounds like for you that even in the writing process that you're thinking very meticulously about the visual elements, and particularly for a film like this, there's so many different elements to pull together. You've got the intimacy of her bedroom, all of the production details, and you can really see that you've gone into every single corner and thought about what that's going to look like, down to thinking about what is the internet going to look like for her, what's the aesthetic of that going to be, and then the effects as you're flowing in and out of consciousness as well. And so even in the early screenwriting stages, what were the ways in which you were really starting to think so meticulously about all of the visual aesthetic details and how you wanted to create a myriad of different visual stylings that had such linearity between them as well?
Yeah, and I do need to shout out my director of photography, Daniel Patrick Carbone, who's actually a filmmaker who had one of the 5 segments in Collective Unconscious and has made beautiful films himself. This was my first time directing as a filmmaker, and I knew that I needed somebody in my court to collaborate with who like was not just a cinematographer who's incredibly talented, which he is, but is also a filmmaker who understands the dreamlike tone that I was going for with the film. And I think if you've mentioned all 3 now, him, Anna Cobb, our lead actress, and Alex G, our composer, as my 3 like secret weapons on the film creatively. And each one was able to add some ingredient to the overall soup that I was making, that some spice that I wasn't quite able to add myself. And it was in the curation of these voices to invite into the process where I think a lot of the magic of the film came alive. But obviously I did think a ton about visual style, and I could talk about a million different things here, but I'd say like perhaps one thing that was incredibly important to me was the aesthetics of the internet, the varying aesthetics of the internet that you see throughout the film, and trying to find like the beauty in them and the beauty in sort of like amateur homemade work. I would talk a lot about our nostalgia as a culture for VHS tapes. And, that you see that now more and more in films, people who sort of like grew up in the 90s watching VHS, returning to VHS aesthetics on purpose, this sort of like degraded fuzzy quality of a VHS as something that they see beauty in. And I think I'm very similar with kind of like low res dial-up internet video content, this sort of like pixelated, blown out, quality of like an early YouTube video or a flash video that you streamed online. And so much of like the joy of the film for me was about finding like a really artful and cinematic lens through which to use that kind of aesthetic. And like for instance, that scene with Anna, with the eye and face paint, which is sort of like come to live on as the picture, like the thing that even if you haven't seen the movie. That was filmed on photo booth on a Mac laptop. The highest quality version that we have that is very, very low quality. And it was specifically the fuzz of photo booth that I remembered from my teenage years that like I wanted to capture. And there are several scenes in the movie. We shot a lot of the movie on screen recording. We shot a lot of the movie on photo booth. We shot a lot of the movie on like an amateur camcorder that the character uses to film things. And all of that was, I just think there's such beauty in the low resolution in a way that like if it wasn't shot that way, the film would not be the film. And there were so many fun surprises. Like once we were camera testing and actually on set and figuring out how these like consumer grade pieces of equipment worked and using that to our advantage. And then the rest of the film, the sort of like the third person camera in the movie proper is shot on the Alexa Mini in a mode that they have called the Super 16 mode, which is sort of meant to mimic 16 millimeter film. But for our purposes, I'm like less concerned with mimicking the way 16 millimeter looks and more just adds a sort of softness to the frame that was really important to me. Alex G's music was like you said, an important influence. And there's this like music genre that I'm really drawn to that I guess is sort of sometimes called like bedroom pop. And like really meticulously crafted, beautiful, incredible music recorded like on a the sort of myth of it being like a carpet floor and in someone's bedroom on an 8-track or 4-track recorder. And I tried to think of my film as like a bedroom film in a lot of ways. I really wanted it to, not just for the sake of saving money, like I wanted there to be this sort of like intimacy in the way it looked and the way it was crafted that felt not cheap but felt homemade. Because it is such a personal film and it is such a film that's like really inviting you into an intimate and gentle space. I just felt that like the film needed to honor that in its aesthetics and in the way it was shot.
Yeah. And there's so many ways throughout the film in which you make it really feel immersive and sensory. When you use the flickering of lights, it happens just enough to make it really sensory without ever loading the audience. And, even the immersiveness of having Anna's performance where she's almost breaking the fourth wall by looking at us, but also not quite, really kind of pulls you in very close where you find yourself sitting closer to the screen. So how are you thinking about all the different ways in which you wanted to create that sort of effect?
It's a minimalist film in a lot of ways, and one of my ideas about the internet is that the internet is one of the many ways that the internet is a paradox. Excuse me. Is I think a lot of art about the internet that we see is quite maximalist. It's like the Tim and Eric Adult Swim style. Like you have 100 tabs open on your browser window and all of this information is flying at you at the speed of light and you can't keep up with it, and it's just everything surrounding you at top speed. And that's certainly a truthful read of what it can feel like to be on the internet, but I wanted to take a different approach, because the paradox of course is that like while it does feel like that sometimes, what it actually is just me alone in a room with this box in front of me, and in silence. And it's so simple and so monotonous. And you see this in a lot of YouTube videos, just these like 20-minute, 25-minute uploads of vloggers like that are just filled with dead air and just like filled with people doing nothing. And I think that is just such a huge part of the internet, the way we use it to kill time, the way we use it to like fill air and do something that is actually nothing, and so I really wanted the film to like feel like that. I really wanted the film to have air to breathe and a lot of space and to kind of like capture and articulate this feeling of being in the middle of this giant thing, but being alone and lonely and bored and restless at home. Such a minimalist film. Anna is like the most important part of the film in every possible way, because so much of the film is literally just her in a bedroom alone staring at us or staring at something. And the casting process and working with her was like the most important thing. And like we got so lucky, but beyond luck, it was just this incredible collaboration that, was so much hard work on her part to command the screen. It really was like choreographing an 80-minute dance. There is a dance in the movie, but beyond that, Anna is one of the most driven artists that I've ever met. She was 17 years old, still in high school when we filmed, but by the time we got to set, she had choreographed every eye movement, every physical movement, let alone dialogue and everything else in the film. Her script was marked up like a David Foster Wallace novel with footnotes, and she this is why I think the film feels so alive, is because of how much work went into that, to the point where we were then able to do so much improvisation on set because she knew everything, she had it all memorized. And like, again, it's a slow film. Like, the metronome of the film for me was very important in sort of creating this, like, a lot of space for this, like, in between space of using the internet. But I also didn't want to bore people just for the sake of boring people. So much, I think, of what you're asking about is like the way the film unfurls itself, and the way that it sort of subtly builds tension, or like opens itself up at moments when you're starting to feel claustrophobic. It's a really fun trick, I think, of making work about the internet and about a screen, is that, like, in essence, this movie takes place in two rooms, but it feels so much more expansive because we're constantly sort of like disappearing into the screen, which is taking us to all of these different places.
Yeah. And diving into what you were saying about working with Anna as well, because to your own assertion, you've said that it was a challenging part for anybody to play because it's a character who to some degree is both ambiguous and also very complex. And, the film really does ride on her performance, exactly as you said. And it's very different to be working on a character where you're giving a singular performance that much time on the screen as well. And particularly when there's so many different directions that she could have taken her performance in any single one of those scenes. What was a lot of the character work that the two of you did together to get to that point where you could do a lot of improvisation on set?
I mean, it was months and months of work. We really did both commit to that being, and I'm so glad we had that. The film would be so much worse and just a completely different movie if we didn't have that time before production. We were meeting weekly. We were talking additionally over Skype because this was before Zoom was a thing. We spent so much time. We were running through scenes, but so much more of it was actually like trying to get on the use trying to develop a common language through which to talk about like who this character is and why this character is. Anna's an incredible actor, and there's so much of Anna in the character. That was a big part of it too, was like fusing her with this person on the page. She's such a strong personality. And you do see her real personality, I think, come across a bit in the film, but she's also like, her craft is incredible. Like, Anna is not an internet person. She doesn't like horror movies. And so much of like the early conversations about who this character was trying to get on the same page about like what Casey was looking for and like what beauty Casey sees in these really dark places. Having her not tap into like the darkness of the character, but like what the character loves and the vulnerability and the loneliness of the character. But we did so many different types of exercises. She would record every week a YouTube video, like a 20-minute vlog in character as Casey. And we would, I would like sort of like give her prompts for those, and then we would watch them together and talk about it. I remember there was one that wasn't quite there with who the character was early on, but there's this one moment at the end of this like 20-minute vlog where Anna just sort of slowed down and said, well, we'll see. Maybe something will happen. And we both zeroed in on it, and we were both like, there it is. That's the character. Maybe something will happen. And just sort of this slow, lonely, quiet, pregnant pause. Like we found it together. And then just so many amazing things, like I remember her first audition, she read the climactic scene of the film. And we had her do one take where she laughs at the guy, which was not in the script, but it was sort of like an idea that we had together, was that, like how would this play if she was sort of like, instead of sounding really hurt, she was hurt, but it was masked underneath this sort of, like, I'm not going to show you I'm hurt, I'm going to make fun of you kind of thing. And when I saw Anna do that, I like literally blew back. It was just like, oh my God, there it is. And it's so powerful. And this was all, it was just character stuff. It was getting to understand, like you said, this very complex character. I remember one of the first things she said that I really latched onto, and I really believe is true for everybody, and definitely for this character, is she said, when we were talking about Casey, she said, everybody is a lot of different people. And I think that that's like so brilliant. And like the contradictions of this character, she just created such a, the base of it isn't like Casey's lonely or Casey's angry or Casey wants to kill her dad. It's like Casey is a lot of different things depending on her mood and where she is today. Like just this, all of these different pieces, like types of energy flying around depending on the scene, and she fused it all together into something holistic, which is just incredible. And and then it was just about creating an incredible environment and a safe space for us to both be really creative within on set. And like that was just like atmosphere and working with lovely people and sort of like putting together the schedule in a really overt way to like give ourselves time and space for the stuff that we wanted to have time and space to dream with. This is why a lot of the film is shot in long takes, is sort of like coverage doesn't really work with improvisation. And like I really wanted space for like to capture lightning in a bottle rather than just like kind of capture a really good performance that was perfectly planned. And the example I always use is the tarot card scene in the center of the film, which that's all Anna. She was doing tarot card readings for us the night before, and we had a little extra time on the schedule, and I was like, hey, do you want to do a scene where you do a tarot card reading for the other character in the film? And the only note I gave her was just like, do a tarot card reading for him right into the camera, make it really mean. And everything else, she was just she had tapped so deeply into who that character was and where they were coming from that they were, she was able to do something that I could never have written.
Something that I've always admired about your career trajectory is the way in which you've always had such a sense of community and support for other creatives and other storytellers. And whether it's going back to Collective Unconscious, which we were talking about earlier, which was such a community of filmmakers, or Ice Slicer, that was very much about celebrating and lifting up and finding new ways to work with short filmmakers, or when you worked at Kickstarter, helping people figure out, maybe who'd been in this industry for a while or who were making their first project, stepping into entertainment for the first time. But also, I imagine that that's also been really influential on you with all of the filmmakers and creatives that you've had an opportunity to work so closely with as well. So with that sense of community and with the closeness and the relationships that you've had with so many other filmmakers and storytellers over the years, how do you feel that that's really influenced the voice that you have found for yourself as a filmmaker? Because I think one of the things is that when you look at World's Fair, you're a filmmaker who has such a clear idea of who you are and the types of stories that you want to tell. And so I was interested in kind of the formation and the outside influences that played into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it was like just seeing other people, whether they be peers or influences or just like, legendary filmmakers who I idolize, having like the courage of their convictions to try over time to create a language of their own in this medium rather than like trying to make work that fits into existing languages or that like perfects commercial models of filmmaking. And so like a huge part of like my artistic sort of origin story was just meeting other amazing filmmakers and being around different sets and being around different people and seeing how they dreamed and seeing what was important to them in their craft and in their artistic pursuit, and sort of like identifying what really resonated with me in there. And and I definitely have a passion for and predilection for work that, like I've talked about, is more atmospheric or more, like sort of towing the line with not just being strictly narrative, but introducing certain experimental or experiential elements into it. And a huge part of it for me was also, though, like getting really serious about film history, which I kind of came too late. I watched tons of contemporary film and I had found what I loved, there, but then I traced it back and figured out what all of those people were ripping off. And I, like really committed myself to a practice that I was going to take seriously in the same way that like my favorite filmmakers throughout history have taken their practice seriously, which is a hard thing to do in our contemporary era. And you know, it was just like about like finding other people who had been through the struggle of trying to like push a medium in a direction that would let them articulate something that they really wanted to articulate, and not letting myself off the hook by being like self-effacing about it, being like, no, I'm an artist and I'm going to take this really, really seriously. And you know, like every thing that I do is a learning experience to help me do the next thing. It's not like I'm starting over and it's like, now I'm going to make a rom-com. It's sort of like a body of work that I'm building over a long period of time. And I guess like the last thing I'd say on that subject is I take really seriously like the like tone and vibe of a set, and atmosphere that you're creating on set. You know, and I've been on all kinds of sets. I've been on really toxic and stressful sets, and I've been on sets that feel like summer camp, you know, where everyone is just like together dreaming of something. And you know, like to a certain degree, vibe as the director, you're like setting a tone, but it's also in some ways out of your control. But I'm a big believer that at least for the types of films that I want to make, which are not necessarily films that are like mine, they're mine and a group of collaborators. I I really believe in like that being an empowering, positive, and like spiritual, creative process for everyone involved. If it's not that, like, I'm not going to do a good job, you know, I'm just going to feel like some jerk, like making people, like bossing people around and telling them what to do and being like, trust me, I'm a genius, you know, and it's just like, that's when my imposter syndrome kicks in. It's, you know, and so that has sort of become part of my process, is like making sure that the projects that I'm developing are ones that are going to be like living when we're making them. And you know, and that is something that I've learned from you know, other filmmakers that I admire and collaborators and peers. And I think it's like as important as anything.
Yeah. Well, I think it's so clear that your distinctiveness and the types of stories that you tell as a filmmaker is exactly why everybody at North Bend immediately thought of you for this award. And thank you. Yes, it's such an amazing and beautiful award. And thank you so much for sharing all of this with us, Jane, and sharing the film with the festival.
I'm so honored, and yeah, I hope everyone watching enjoys or enjoyed the film. Thanks for having me.